Canada's obsession with housing is cannibalizing economic productivity. That's what I'm going to be chatting about today. My name is John Pasals, president at Realosophy Realty in the Toronto area. Anyone, if you're looking at buying, selling, or investing, you can click the link in the show notes below to set up a meeting with me and one of my agents. And as always, if you find the video helpful, please like and subscribe. So, productivity, economic productivity has been in the news quite a bit lately. Bank of Canada highlighted as a national emergency. So today I want to talk about what exactly that means in the relationship between economic productivity and the housing market, and what that means for all of us. So at a high level, when we think about what does productivity mean, I mean, generally, it's a measure of the efficiency in which, our economy transforms inputs into outputs. Are we efficient at it or are we not efficient at it? And the Bank of Canada kind of noted three ways or elements that contributes to strong productivity. The first they said is basically something called capital intensity, which means giving workers tools, whether that's machinery, equipment, or intellectual property in the case of obviously more advanced economies and new technologies to make them more efficient. The second is a labor composition, so improving the skills and training of the labor force. And then something they call multi-factor productivity, which is using capital and labor collectively more efficiently. So today I'm going to touch on some stats in a report that was published by Charles St. Arnaud, the chief economist at Alberta Central. He did a great report kind of highlighting some of these tensions. And he noted that back in the 1970s, Canada actually had the sixth highest level of labor productivity in the OECD of the 32 countries. And today we rank 22nd. So we've dropped quite a bit from the 1970s. This chart that we're going to take a quick look at is actually from the Globe and Mail, which kind of benchmarks a bunch of countries against the US. So the US is sort of the benchmark at 100% sort of labor productivity. So that's kind of what we're measuring everyone against. We can kind of see Canada is well below that, 79%. A lot of countries ahead of us, including Italy, Australia, Britain, and a number of countries even more productive than the US, Germany, Austria, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. So Canada's lagging behind, and one of the reasons highlighted in this report and what a lot of economists have been saying is that Canada's just not investing as much in machinery, equipment, and intellectual property. More of our capital is going towards residential investments, namely renovations and ownership transfer costs, effectively agent fees and the costs associated with that. So if we look at investment as a percentage of GDP, residential since about 2000 has really surged. I mean, it's kind of bounced around for quite a few years, but before that, from the 60s to 2000, but has really taken off since 2000. And we can kind of see that non-residential investment as a percentage of GDP has been declining. Now, when we look at how Canada stacks up against the US and Australia, when we're looking at the residential investment as a component of GDP, we can kind of see that from the 60s to the 2000s, we were definitely above the US and kind of in line with Australia. But since 2000, we can kind of see a big divergence. I mean, the US largely plummeted in part because of their housing bubble and their financial crisis, and has since recovered a little bit. But Canada has just soared, and now we're well above. We're basically double. Residential investment as a percent of the GDP is basically double what it is in the US, and well above what it is in Australia. And then when we look at non-residential investment, comparing Canada, US, and Australia again, once again, we see, these mixed signals from 1960 to 2000 sort of bouncing around, still well below the US and Australia, but a really big divergence between sort of after 2000, where investments in machinery, equipment, and intellectual property technology have really plummeted in Canada, compared to the United States. Australia also has declined, interestingly enough. So we've definitely declined significantly compared to the US, but Australia has also seen a decline in investments for machinery, equipment, and intellectual property. Now, one question, of course, is, well, why is this happening? In the report from Alberta Central said, well, rather than looking at the demand side, they wanted to look and start asking, not demand meaning why aren't businesses borrowing? They think and they argue it has more to do actually with the supply of credit and the lack of available money or high financing costs for businesses specifically. And the idea with this is that when businesses see a little bit more risk or significantly more risk with lending money to businesses for capital investments, the rates are going to be higher and definitely and effectively debt and capital is less available. And a lot more capital they see has been directed actually to household credit and mainly residential mortgages rather than business credit over the years. And part of this is, at the end of the day, lenders, banks have to look at whatever is going to provide them the best return after adjusting for risk, right? And, what they're effectively finding is that the higher risk on corporate lending relative to households, especially when we take into account that the collateral on household debt is actually appreciating, is one of the big factors that has really made banks sort of want to plow more money into houses and into residential investment rather than business investment. And the other is that the likely higher capital requirements for corporate lending when compared to residential investments. Now, one thing they also touch on is how these differences, these risk-adjusted sort of measures of what is a better return can kind of crowd out different segments of the borrowing kind of pool. So when we look at sort of who are net borrowers and net lenders over time, they're looking from the 1960s to today. And what they're finding here is that between the 70s and basically up until about 2000, let me pull up a little arrow here to make this a little bit easier to see. In here in red, it's basically showing that households were basically net savers or net lenders during that period. And the big borrowers were corporations to some extent and the government. And what has happened since 2000 is, of course, a big shift. I mean, the corporations up above this bar are effectively savers, and they're borrowing significantly less, whereas households have seen significantly more debt and are effectively net borrowers. And this is effectively what Arnault's talking about in his report, that banks are basically more willing to lend today to households. Now, of course, a lot of this has happened over the past, this isn't new, this happened over the past 20, 25 years. And I think part of this is a shift towards, what sort of economists call like privatized Keynesianism. And Keynesianism refers to basically borrowing to stimulate demand in the economy. And historically, that was largely driven by government deficits. And over the past 20 plus years, the government's basically said, well, why do we have to take on all the deficits? Why don't households kind of borrow a little bit more to stimulate our economy? And this has sort of been the evolution of what we've seen in Canada's market. This is, has to do with sort of the relaxing of underwriting, the encouragement of people taking on HELOCs and using that money to, renovate their home, invest in real estate, all of these types of things. And this is one of the reasons why household debt in Canada has surged relative to income and relative to GDP when we compare it against other countries, because Canada's economy is basically leaning on households to borrow against their homes to basically stimulate the economy. And of course, part of that, as they said in the report, is renovations. And, some of this is actually just consumption, quite frankly, borrowing against your home for personal consumption, for investing in housing, and in buying investment property. So this is obviously a big factor that has evolved over 20 years and is impacting productivity in Canada. Now, one of the things that the report says, I mean, how do we kind of reverse this trend? I mean, and it's going to be a very tricky one. I mean, he argues that governments need to have or encourage banks to have more incentives to lend to businesses. But he also says that households need to become net savers, which I don't think is going to happen willingly. I mean, households who have been leaning on household debts to finance their lifestyles, to invest in real estate, to invest in all sorts of things, are not going to suddenly become net savers. I mean, there's kind of one or two approaches that I see that this sort of slowing down sort of the demand on debt from households. One is that home prices don't appreciate very much over the next 2, 3, or 4 years. I don't know if that's going to happen, but if population growths kind of go the way our federal government's arguing, which is seeing negative growth in non-permanent residents and probably total growth of maybe around 300,000 people per year, that'll certainly take pressure off home price appreciation. So if home prices aren't rising, that's going to take a little bit of the debt out of the market, because one of the things that obviously fuels more debt is sort of people tapping into the increase in their home's value. But if their home's not increasing the way it was in the past, we're going to see less borrowing from households. The only other way, if that doesn't happen, is really banks sort of the banks or the federal government with the banking regulators, effectively tightening up credit on borrowing, and they can do this through tightening up HELOC rules, tightening how people are using debt from their existing homes to finance, basically home purchases of investment properties. These are the types of things that can also kind of pull back some of the debt that we're seeing from existing households, some of this consumption. But again, I don't think the governments are going to do that anytime soon. So I can't imagine what they're going to do to reverse this trend. Again, like I said, I think the most likely is if we see modest growth in house prices, then we will probably naturally see less refinancing of homes going on, less people taking debt out to do renovations or to, pay off their credit cards, quite frankly. So we'll see how this all evolves. But obviously, there's this intersection between what's going on with housing, what's going on with residential mortgages that is effectively impacting business productivity in Canada. And is one of the reasons why our performance is very different from other countries, including the United States. So I hope you found that video helpful. If you have any comments, please always post them in the comments below. And you can always send me an email at askjohn@movesmartly.com.